If I were to ask for a show of hands, how many would prefer homemade apple pie before buying one in the store? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Me too. How many would enjoy a batch of homemade chocolate chip cookies to the ones that are sold in a box in the store? Yes. The homemade word homemade makes a lot of people feel good just hearing it. One good memory it recalls to my mind is my grandmother. She could cook up a batch of anything at home and it would taste wonderful. And of course that's true for a lot of people's grandmothers. I've heard stories like that before, but it was true in our family. Advertisers know we like that word. You see it on product labels at the supermarket, things that say words like, made with the best ingredients for that homemade flavor. And recently I saw a package of bagels with this strange statement on it. It said, homemade in our factory kitchens. You know, I laughed, and it seemed to me as if they were trying to elicit something good with the word homemade, but they were effectively ruining their chances with me with the words factory kitchens. Things aren't homemade in a factory, it didn't seem to me. The word home may very well win the prize as one of the warmest words in the English language. 7 or 8 years ago, I led a retreat for a group of married couples at Craigville Conference Center, which is out in Craigville, Massachusetts. Just the simple word home, written at the top of a blank piece of newsprint on an easel, generated the following list of thoughts about what home meant to people. They said a cozy firehouse chat. Fireside chat. It's good to laugh at yourself. Right? A place to invite friends. A place where you can be yourself. A place to spend some time alone. A place where you can sometimes be angry and get over it. A place where love and forgiveness live together. A place where all ages live and work and love together. It's not always alone, it's together with others. A place for holiday gatherings and fun times. Dinner with people with whom to share your day. A safe place. Sometimes a happy, noisy place you wouldn't trade for silence. Quiet place at the end of the day, away from the noisy world. This was a brainstorm, so all different kinds of people were thinking of home from different perspectives. Someone quoted Robert Frost's poem that says that home is where they have to take you in. And the list went on, but I just wanted to give you a sample. Threaded through these thoughts is something about belonging. Home is where one has a strong sense of belonging, and until we find that, we're restless. It's hard to make yourself at home if you don't feel that you belong. And Pat and I went away to Albuquerque, New Mexico to work in a school where we knew no one at all, but we were going to live there for half of the year. It took a little while before we felt like we belonged. But when we did, we were at home. Last week I spotted a sign in the front yard of the Savin Avenue home sporting the words, "Welcome home," with balloons flying in all directions off the sign. And I wondered who the lucky person was. It made me feel good just to think about that. When servicemen and women return from the dangers of faraway places, many gather to welcome them home as their plane lands on or their ship docks in the harbor. Tears of joy and thanksgiving flow freely as people hug away some of the fears and the worries that have been building up during the long periods of absence and uncertainty. Those who might have been lost forever are now home, where there's a deep sense of belonging, something that all of us need somewhere in our lives. We all have a profound need to belong in a friendship, a relationship, a marriage, a church, at work. Until we find that, we're restless in our spirits. Did you notice that the scripture readings this morning are both about people arriving home? The verses from Joshua recall the remarkable moment when their leader Joshua led the ancient Hebrews across the Jordan River to set foot in the promised land, a place God had promised to their forebearer Abraham years before, as that place would one day be their new home. They had come all the way from Egypt, where their ancestors had been Pharaoh's slaves, and they had traveled in the wilderness under the leadership of Moses for most of the way. When Moses became unable to continue, Joshua took over, leading these people to their new home. It wasn't coming home in the sense of returning to a place familiar to them, as when you and I come home from a trip. It was more like moving from a place where you had lived for a long time and now moving on to a new place to build a home and to establish new roots. It was home to them because they understood it to be a place that God had promised to their ancestors. Excuse me. These people were 12 tribes linked together by family ties and common faith. The reason why it took 40 years to arrive at this new home, which really wasn't 40 years worth of distance on the map, is that they didn't remain faithful to God's commandments as to how to live their lives along the way. Their strength and courage were founded and grounded in following commandments from God. Likewise, they were weak, and they suffered consequences of their disobedience along the way. It was an extension of their lostness in the wilderness for 40 additional years. Sin and its consequences were the greatest impediments that interfered with their journey home for as long as they failed to own up to it. Eventually they reached the place called home. Among the first things they did about crossing the Jordan River was to make a circle of 12 stones representing their 12 tribes, giving a special name to this place and praising God for bringing them there. Calvin Coolidge was a man often remembered for his wit and humor, and I've told a couple of Coolidge stories in the past. Here's another. When he returned from church one Sunday, Mrs. Coolidge said, "Well, how was the sermon?" "Fine," replied, well, that doesn't sound like his voice, but I'm trying. "Fine," replied Mr. Coolidge. "What did the minister talk about?" asked the First Lady. "Sin," said the president. "Well, what did he have to say about it?" "He was against it." End of conversation. Man, a few words. Sin is not a popular topic these days, but there is much suffering in life on account of it. You can't read the Bible without dealing with it. It is one of the primary causes for the breakdown of our relationship with God and our broken relationships with others. The sins of the ancient Hebrew people kept them from finding their new home by some 40 years, wandering in the wilderness, wondering who they were and where they were going. After his indulgence in pleasure-seeking is over and his resources are gone, the father's son, we heard of in the parable this morning, he had wandered off, and he winds up with no friends, with barely any food, just the food he's feeding to the pigs. Just the food he's feeding to the pigs. His thinking of just himself and his disobedience against family and others had left him alone and separated him from home. He was in the pits of despair instead of at home. His situation reminds me of the story of an old snake. As the story goes, the old snake, hungry one day, gobbled down a small rabbit with a big bulge in his middle. Just then along came a farmer who didn't like snakes. So the old snake tried to slither through a small hole in the stone wall, and of course he couldn't get through because of the bulge. The consequence. But then there was good news. Another small rabbit hopped in front of them. The old snake gobbled him up with a smile of satisfaction. And then came the bad news. With a bulge on both sides of the fence, the old snake was a goner. Not able to move forward, not able to move backward to escape the tragedy of his situation. I think that the younger son that we hear about in Luke, who left home and squandered his inheritance, eventually found himself in a similar situation. He didn't know which way to turn or which way to go, and he found himself in danger of losing his life itself. Until, as the verses tell us, he came to himself. An expression that could be paraphrased, he realized how foolish he had been, how wrong he had been. He had an awakening and could now see something he could not see before. He saw his sin as sin and didn't try to squirm out of it, avoid it, or rationalize it away. He confronted his situation, his condition, the way his life was going. And he confronted it and called it what it was. He spoke the truth out loud to himself. He was self-aware. He was honest, left the destructive way of life behind, and headed home as a person truly sorry for treating as nothing the things of heaven and home. His first step in the direction of home took place in his heart and in his head, and then his feet and his actions followed. What he could not have known in advance was and must have been eternally grateful for when it happened, was the compassionate, joyful welcome home he received from his father, who ran out to embrace him, simply joyful that he had found his son again, who had been in danger of dying, but he was now safe and alive and at home. This parable of Jesus teaches us that God welcomes us home, no matter what we've done or left undone. Jesus presumably taught this lesson in the presence of some religious leaders, the Pharisees and the scribes, who did not believe that God was this way with people. The leaders believed that Jesus ought to stay away from those people that they considered unclean. More to the point than the physical wanderings of this younger son are the wanderings of his soul, trying to find home in all the wrong places. Like the 40 years in the wilderness, trying to figure out who he was and what the purpose of his life really was. Finding our true home in this life, our need for finding a sense of belonging, has much to do with something that St. Augustine said in his prayer long ago. The words are something like this, although I don't have the quote with me. Our souls are forever restless until they find their rest in Thee. You see, our spiritual home is not a physical place. We can be home anywhere. Our spiritual home is a faithful relationship in everyday life with the one and only God. This home, together with its deep sense of belonging, is readily found in a relationship with Jesus Christ. When we come to ourselves, as it said in the scriptures, when we come to ourselves, realizing how we've been foolish in our treatment of self and others and life itself, and when we're genuinely sorry for the choices we've made that have been wrong, that have caused us to wander from that relationship, thus hindering and delaying our journey toward the fullness of our spiritual home. We can be anywhere and be at home if our relationship with Christ is intact. Let us pray. Dear Lord, our hearts are blessed by your everyday presence. In this Lenten season of preparation for more deeply understanding our relationship with you, our hearts are even now blessed by your everyday presence. We would open our hearts and our minds now to the grace of your presence, that your Spirit might find lodging within our hearts and minds, that we might individually hear your gracious welcome home. Amen.